Hey everyone, Jay here. I wanted to take a moment to remind listeners that if you're interested in participating in my year-long teacher training, we are currently offering the option to start any time at half the regular price. This is going to be available for a limited time, and I just wanted to make sure that you were aware. Start any time at half the regular price. To find out more and register, go to jbrownyoga.com/training. That's jbrownyoga.com/training. All right, look at that. Here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Is this your first time here? If so, hi, welcome. Everybody else, what's up? How are we feeling today? And do you have a sense of how you are in relationship to the momentum of your life? Sometimes I imagine that my life has a current to it, and sometimes it feels like I'm moving with the current. And sometimes that current can pick up and life's momentum takes over and propels you along, sometimes against your will, and then deposits you down the river, And then sometimes the current feels like it shifts and like it's running against the direction that you're supposed to go. And then you're making an effort. You're working against the current's flow, just to keep yourself going in the direction that you need to be going. And then sometimes the current just kind of dies and it feels like it's at a standstill and you're not going anywhere. And I feel like if I can have a sense of that current and paddle along at the times that are helpful and constructive and not paddle along at other times, just let the current take over. Sometimes I find that to be a helpful notion. And I guess I'm just curious how it is for you today. How's it going with whatever you're doing right now? Are you taking a walk? Are you on the treadmill? Are you having a tea? Whatever it is, I hope things are going okay, and I really appreciate that you've chosen to listen. I have also been thinking some about the idea of spiritual awakening. It's a topic we've discussed on this show many times over the years. And sometimes people talk about spiritual awakening as sort of a gradual unfoldment of awareness and like an expanding of consciousness. But sometimes, at least in the older days, it used to get talked about in a way where it was like a life-shattering experience that you have, that in a moment somebody can have an awakening and they're forever changed thereafter. And I think it's an idea that has gotten frowned upon some over the years, probably because people claim to be spiritually awakened or claim to have had an awakening when they haven't. And so we've all become totally skeptical, and rightly so, because there's a lot of charlatans out there and we should be discerning. Although, I suppose it depends on which school of yoga you align with. I imagine there might be people listening to this who are Kundalini Yoga practitioners who talk about awakenings all the time like it's no big thing. And, it's interesting. When I think back, I dabbled in a little Kundalini Yoga at one point, but it didn't suit me very well. And when I inquired into the founder of Kundalini Yoga, Yogi Bhajan, I was highly skeptical. It just seemed like all the people I knew who were very devout Kundalini Yoga practitioners talked about Yogi Bhajan with a great deal of reverence, and yet there wasn't a lot of concrete information about him or about where the practice that he taught was coming from. And I don't believe that I've ever had anyone on the show who had any direct experience with Yogi Bhajan until today. My guest is Ron Brent. And Ron spent some time with Yogi Bhajan in the early formative time of his, I don't know what you call it, career? Ascension? I don't know what you call it. But he encountered and spent time and studied with and taught under the auspices of Yogi Bhajan in the early days of Kundalini Yoga. And he then went on to become a disciple of Muktananda. And it's just a very rare opportunity to get to speak with someone like Ron, who has this direct experience. Oftentimes folks like Ron don't like to come on podcasts and stuff. So I'm so thankful that he ended up taking the invitation, and it is a great honor for me to have this conversation with him and to then be able to share his insights with you. Real quick before we get to it, I do want to mention that I have some in-person events coming up. July 29th, I'm going to be in Garden City, New York. September 23rd and 24th, I'm in Manchester, England. September 30th and October 1st, I'm in Dublin, Ireland. If you live in any of these places and you listen to the show, come hang out with me. You can find out more and register for those events and find all of my other stuff. I've got a full spectrum of things on offer. You can find all of my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. We'll just leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Ron Brent. Hello, Ron.
Awesome, Jay. Hi, nice to meet you finally.
Nice to meet you. I really appreciate you giving me some of your time today. Thank you for this.
Well, I appreciate you giving me a little chance to be public.
Well, I maybe you've listened to the show before. I am already recording. If it's okay with you, I'd like to just consider us having begun. Is that all right?
Absolutely. And I like what you said about just having a conversation. Is it nice? Makes it nice and easy.
I prefer that, and I do whatever I can to make it feel more like that. My idea has always been that if you and I were just to sit at a cafe and have a cup of tea, I would be interested to talk to you about some things.
Well, I got my tea here.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. So there you go. It's the next best thing. And just to clue in anybody else who might listen to this at another time, why I'm excited to speak with you is that since I started this show, there's been a kind of ongoing idea behind it, which was to do some oral history about yoga coming to the West. And then even sort of once it got to the West, the way it kind of went from obscurity to mainstream. And I caught the tail end of that kind of wave moving into the mainstream, you know? It's crashed now, I think. But what I would say is there's this time, like when I came into early 90s in New York, the teachers that I had all made these like trips to India in the late 60s and 70s, and I guess some in the early 80s, and met these gurus and came back and then had these storefronts with altars with their pictures on them.
Right.
And then it all hit the mainstream, and you know, these figures, these teachers, these guru figures were kind of regarded in a certain way for such a long time. They were the masters. They were the authorities for yoga. Yep. And I certainly had the narrative of I should go to India and find my guru because that's what my teachers had done. And I actually did make a trip there in like the early 90s, but I didn't find one. I tried, but I didn't find one. But there was that idea of going to meet someone and maybe getting shaktipat, and like that was a prevalent idea when I came into yoga, but that idea went away over time.
Yeah.
So in any case, all this is just a long-winded way to sort of introduce that you're somebody I know who was kind of right there in the 60s when it was first kind of coming in, and you had experience with a number of these guru figures. So I'm glad to have you here to give us some firsthand accounts specifically about Yogi Bhajan, because he's sort of one of the ones I know the least about, honestly.
Yep. Well, good.
Well, I guess to get us going,
I just wanted to add one little
please go ahead.
tidbit that around it right now here on the East Coast, it's 25 minutes to 3. About 5:30, my ex-partner, who I haven't seen for 3 years, will be coming to stay with me for the next 2-3 days. And that's Sridhar Silberfein, who started the Bhakti Fest. But Sridhar and I went way back to having a natural food store, but of consequence in Topanga Canyon, and a spiritual center there where we did a lot of stuff with Ram Dass. And we had Kalu Rinpoche stayed with us, and Chidananda from Rishikesh, from Shivananda's ashram. And I could go on and on. But so I was able to meet many of the teachers. But let's talk about Yogi Bhajan.
Yeah, no, we can talk about a lot of these figures. And just to mention, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. So I was born in 1972, and in 1988, I got my driver's license. And the coolest thing to do was to drive over the hill. I used to ride my bike through Topanga Canyon at one point, but I would drive over the hill to Melrose Avenue to get like a new pair of shoes, a pair of creeper shoes that you couldn't get in the valley.
Yeah.
So to think that 20 years earlier, Yogi Bhajan had like a single room yoga, 1,000 square foot yoga studio there, kind of blows my mind a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's where he, I think he originally came into Toronto, and I don't really know that history, but he definitely got his footprint down in Los Angeles, on Melrose.
Well, I read also that you had like a year stint, you said, in Scientology before you started finding your way in that direction towards the yoga. And I guess I'm curious about what prompted you to be interested in Scientology, and what made you feel like it wasn't the right way to go for you. Maybe there's some obvious reasons for that, but I'm curious at the time.
I mean, it's a beautiful story in my mind. But the thing is that I flat out was afraid to ever say I was in Scientology, not because I feared them, but I just didn't want them on my case, So when I started doing a sort of this mini memoir, if you will, I said, well, I have to mention Scientology because it was significant. And here's what happened. After I had my awakening in 1967, I felt the need to get out of Los Angeles. So along with another person, a friend of mine, we went and got jobs up in Sequoia National Park cleaning out cabins. And we figured that was the place to get away, because he was actually sold us weed. and I was in a crowd that drove new sports cars and went to top clubs, the Whiskey and PJs and other clubs in LA, and always, we always had a nice table, and I kind of ran with that kind of crowd. And this guy Mark he went to school with some of the guys that I hung out with. And so he used to come and sold us good weed for like $10 an ounce. And nobody paid much attention to him because he always just wore a white t-shirt, jeans, sandals, and kind of John Lennon glasses, and drove a Volkswagen bus. and always kind of had this beatific smile on his face, you know. And so after I had my awakening, I was in a couldn't really orient to my previous life. I'm talking about like within 48 hours. And Mark happened to come by, see if we need anything, and I just made a connection with him. And the guy had taken a lot of acid, and but he was very mellow, a gentleman, you know, just a really good guy. And it was the first, after my awakening, it was the first person I could really like relate to. So we got into discussions about what it was that didn't allow us to remain in that state, or to maintain that state. And we figured that that being in Los Angeles probably didn't help it much. So we decided to go somewhere remote. So we went to the mountains in Sequoia. And after a couple of weeks, after actually close to a couple of months up there, I was just roller coastering. I'd go into states where I'd be really aware, great meditations, and then doubts would come and fear. And it was just like, I was getting slammed, you know, back and forth. And so Mark went down for his draft board, went to a party, and met somebody who was in Scientology. And Mark came up the next day and said, "Hey, I met this guy. He told me about this thing. It's like, gives you like the state of Buddha, but you don't have to drop out. You can stay in the world and everything." So he said, I said, "What the hell? Let's go give it a try." And before I knew it, I got sucked into its culture. And any aspirations of spiritual life kind of faded way into the background. And Ron Hubbard had come out with a new version of Dianetics, which was the predecessor to Scientology. And so it was a big buzz, and they picked 100 people to come from all over the world, Scientology centers, to take this special course. And so the way I was chosen was one of those people. And one of the ways that Scientology studies is they give you a theory, and then they give you the practical. And for practical, you have a little box, and everybody's got little trinkets in it. Sometimes there's a rock, and an eraser, paper clips, a pencil, a twig, leaves, something. And what you're supposed to do is you sit with a partner at a card table, opposite each other, and you take turns, and you do this theory, and then you demonstrate that you really understand it by taking these objects and putting them in relationship with each other in such a way that it conveys that you understand the concept. Well, this was a 4-week course, and this is about 3 weeks into it. And they have a grading scale, and I was graded up towards the top of this class. And at the end of the day, we're in this room, 100 of us with 50 card tables in rows. And at the end of the day, there's fluorescent lights over. It's very difficult.
I remember seeing people like in the subways with those like biofeedback machines where they do that test for you or whatever.
It's called an e-meter. It measures a half a volt of electricity that passes through 2 electrodes, basically goes through, I guess, what you would call your aura, but your
your magnetic sphere or whatever.
Your magnetic, the sphere that surrounds your body, field. Mm-hmm. And it measures the resistances out. So they ask you certain questions, and as you respond to them, it stimulates something in your mind that you weren't dealing with. And then when you look at it and deal with it, that half volt of electricity ceases to meet resistance, and that I don't know why I'm not being able to say it right now.
It's that twisting field, around your tongue. I understand.
Really, that field, and that's how you tell what somebody's finished with an issue. But at any rate, at the end of the day, it's nighttime. It's a 12-hour course, and we're all cleaning up. And the guy in the table next to me looks down, and there's a dried twig with a leaf on it, and he can't figure out whose little demonstration kit it came out of. So he holds it up and says, "Who does this belong to?" And his moment when he said that, and I looked at it, I had a Satori experience. I mean, I'm tingling right now thinking about it. But I had a moment of illumination, and I said, "It belongs to itself." Like that, with this Shakti, with
you answered him. You answered him honestly.
and he looked at me, and he said, "What are you, some kind of philosopher?" And so I took that in. I looked around the room, and I figured I would have got the same response from anybody in there. And I walked out the door an hour later, and I never came back. So that's my Scientology career in a nutshell.
I got you. That's like a clear moment where the instructor reveals something that's like a clear message. Oh, okay. I've learned whatever I need to learn here, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So after wait, before we go on, you mentioned this awakening that you had. And I guess I read a little bit about that you've written down about it, that you were reading a book. Did I get it right? Was it under the influence of entheogens, or was it just reading a book? Can you say something about that experience? It certainly seemed to shape your direction.
Well, yeah. And I think I wrote about it fairly clearly. But at any rate, basically, and no, I was not under anything. I was not under the influence of anything. It's a rather long story, but I'll try. And it's hard for me because it's hard for me to take something that has a lot of emotion for me and to put it you know what I mean?
I completely understand. You're like, how do I wrap this into a nice thing for Jay's podcast? When it doesn't really have good words. And I've learned that more and more, trying to tackle certain more, I guess you would say, esoteric or harder to certain topics that maybe aren't always best to discuss, honestly. So I'm happy for you to defer some. I guess I ask about it because I think a lot of people have had certain moments where they tapped into something or they had some kind of experience that shaped them thereafter. And I talked with Gregor Male, I remember when he came on, about how actually you don't really want to go too deep into samadhi if you want to be in this world, in a way that there's a reason for us having some filters in order to kind of exist here. So it sometimes is actually quite traumatic, even though there seems to be a blessing to it, some of these kinds of experiences, like how to be in the world after they happen. So in any case, I don't know whatever you want to say about it now, and then I'm happy for us to move on to how it unfolded thereafter.
Good, I appreciate that. Well, I wrote about it, I think, fairly articulately, and I gave it a lot of thought. So
we'll link to that so everybody can read it for sure.
Yeah, so with that. But basically, what happened was I met a kid at school. I was going to junior college, city college. And I met a kid in my photography class, and he thought that Damien would be a great book. He was surprised that I never heard of Hermann Hesse, first of all, because that wasn't the kind of dude I was.
At that time, it would have been assumed that you probably would have read it.
We're talking about 1967.
Right.
And a magical year. And so he gave me the book, and I was just not a book reader, so I told him how to read it, but I had no intention. And some weeks later, I'm sitting at home at night, a Friday night, where I'd normally be out at a club, a date or at a club, and I was just feeling something weird going on. And so I stayed home, and I couldn't quite figure out what was happening with me. And all of a sudden, the book just went bong in my head. And I went down and got it out of my car, came up, started reading it, got sucked into it. Hesse is a bona fide genius. Consequently, I've read a number of his books. but Damien was the first one, and what it did basically was it triggered something in me. It's like it pulled out a lynch pin, and all the the blocks came tumbling down. It triggered something, and it built up to a crescendo in terms of a very difficult mental situation. I went into a state where a lot of fear, a lot of images, erotic images, fearful, deathly images, all kinds of things. I mean, and this was not on a psychedelic. And as I write about on the blog, I had to go into the bathroom and look at myself in the mirror as if I would, what I used to do when I took acid and something was happening. I would talk myself down.
You're trying to get your bearings. I understand.
I'd say, hey man, you took a chemical, you took something, a couple of hours, you're going to be back to normal. Just, let it go.
And this time you're looking at yourself and I didn't take anything.
Yeah. And it's coming on, and I'm seeing my face, like, I'm seeing the pores, and I'm seeing the capillaries, and I'm seeing hair follicles, and my eyes, and my senses are heightened. And I go back, and I'm still like disturbed, and I go back, sit on my bed, and start reading, and it built to a crescendo, and the best I can describe it is it like exploded into complete silence and ecstasy and. My hair stands on end now.
I guess my curiosity about this, or I'm not about this, but what you said do you have any idea, looking back at it now, if there was something that, I don't know, was it just a spontaneous occurrence, or can you see like little signposts of markers that led up to it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I saw in my vision, my life in front of me. And I saw that when I say saw, I mean, intuitive insight. And I was able to see that every single thing I did in my life had to happen in order for that awakening to take place. So, and a point that I mention is that when I was in my teens, maybe 13 or 14 years old, I got caught stealing 45 records from the drugstore in my neighborhood. And as the police were holding me, my aunt and uncle happened to walk through the door. So this became like a family thing. And, but it was singled out to me that if that hadn't happened, if my aunt and uncle hadn't walked through that door when those police were holding me, I wouldn't have had that experience. Now, I don't mean this for people to like, first of all, I'm not a teacher, which puts a big smile on my face because I'm not beholden to anybody for anything.
You were in the past, but you're not now, is what you're saying, right?
Nothing.
Yeah.
And, but anyway, I saw that, I had the understanding that everything you do leads up to that. And I mean, I don't know what value there is in knowing that, because you're still going to do whatever you do, but, so.
But it changed your perceptive lens on things, I imagine. Like you're aware of a certain underlying fabric to what's playing out, or life, or what, I don't know what exact the right words are. And that becomes a new perceptual lens, I would imagine.
Well, you see what it is that has become all this, including yourself. That's the ultimate, in my mind. This is, everybody's going to have their own idea what this is. But you see, you experience what a human being has been created to experience.
Interesting. Beautiful. Very lovely. Well, listen,
but you don't stay in that state. That's the point.
Yeah.
Different lenses come in according to how you've lived your life,
Well, listen,
and what needs to be finished.
Let's put a pin in that, because I want to come back to that in terms of awakened states and what the implications they might have on people's lives. I want to return to that, and now I want to go to how you might have come to some of the ways that you processed that initial experience, because it seems to me, from what I understand, that initial experience, you didn't have a teacher at that time, that it was after that happened in a way that you sought teachers. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely.
And then you did your little bit of Scientology. You got the clear message. You're like, nah. And then I heard something about, what was it that you heard an interview with Shivananda? Is that right?
Yep.
And so how did the interview with Shivananda lead to you studying with Yogi Bhajan?
Well, I was, after Scientology, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I couldn't find the inspiration to put myself on a path again. So, I was sitting home one morning, living in West Hollywood, and I was turning the radio dial, listening, just kind of restlessly trying to find something on FM radio I could connect with. And I heard this voice, and I took my hand off the dial, and the voice was so calming. I mean, and so it touched me. It grabbed me. And so I took my hand off the dial, I listened, and it was Swami Satchidananda being interviewed. And then at some point in the interview, the interviewer asked him, "But isn't yoga hard? Isn't it difficult?" And Swamiji said, "Not when you know the greatness of the goal." And when he said that, he had such conviction that it just like, I went like,
I want to know the greatness of the goal.
Yes, that's it. That's what I lost, and so it reawakened that in me. And and then he said at the end of the interview that he was going to be speaking at the Wilshire Eagle Theater in a couple of days. So I got all excited. And then I went to a health food store, and there was a poster there announcing his talk. So I had a visual of what he looked like, and I was all excited to go see him. It was in January. It was January 9th, 1970. And so I went to visit my parents the next day in Culver City, which is where I grew up, by the way, over the hill from you.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm driving home to West Hollywood. I'm going up Melrose to turn right on. I'm going up Robertson. Sorry, I'm going up Robertson, north on Robertson, then to turn east on Melrose. And that's where his ashram. And I happen to pull up to the intersection. I'm pulling up just as this throng of people are coming out, all dressed in white, except for one dressed in orange. And that was Swami Satchidananda, who was Yogi Bhajan's guest that day.
So this is like a couple of days before the big talk that you were going to go to?
Exactly. So I pull my car over, park it. I come, and there's 200 young people all dressed in white, both Yogi Bhajan students and Satchidananda students. Dressing with white was what you did in those days. Mm-hmm. And so, which makes me laugh when I think about it. But when I lived in India, I wore white anyway all the time. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so I pulled over, and then, as fate would have it, I got corralled by Yogi Bhajan students into signing up for classes there. And I never made it to Swami Satchidananda. Although I got to know him a little bit over the years, but still. And that's how I ended up with Yogi Bhajan.
All right. So was Yogi Bhajan teaching all the classes, or did he have a staff of teachers?
He was teaching most of them at that point.
And so
or many of them, as I can remember.
And so what was your initial impression of Yogi Bhajan?
he was like, he was, it's an interesting question because I haven't really thought about that.
Can you put yourself back to the first class? What did you do in the first class?
That's exactly what I'm doing. He was overwhelming in a good way. The way, and I alluded to this, the way a good coach might be overwhelming. If you're a basketball player, baseball player, football player, soccer, he's a good coach, a good disciplinary coach. Just enough inspiration, motivation, and with rigor,
So he was kind of a hard ass, is what you're saying? He was
a hard ass, but it wasn't. It wasn't. I wouldn't have called him a hard ass. Because it was inspiring. I mean, it was, and it was my first real introduction to yoga. I had one yoga class I took with the East European, like in the back office of a New Age newspaper in '67. So this is 3 years later. This is my first real introduction to yoga, and I threw myself into it 100%.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that because 23 years later, I'm in a Kundalini Yoga class, and the teacher's got a book, and the teacher's flipping the book open, and it says prosperity exercise 1 through 43. And she just goes, we're going to do 22 today, and that's the kriya that we did that morning. And I remember asking, how do you decide which one you're going to do? And she's like, oh, I just think of it like the Tao Te Ching, and I just kind of flip it open. And I was like, what? This, it made no sense to me. So I'm assuming at that time there wasn't that book of all
by the way, that comes from a Sikh tradition. What they do with the Guru Granth Sahib.
Okay.
Is you open it up, and whatever poem you focus on, that's like your teaching for that period.
So that's like a legit thing. She wasn't just talking about...
Well, it's a legit thing, but...
Okay.
But yeah. I'm going to leave it at that.
At that time in those early classes, and I read you were going to 2 to 3 classes a week, so you got to see him at this very formative early time, it seems to me. How many people were in class on average?
I'm going to guess 40.
Okay, that's not
maybe
crazy.
40, maybe 45, maybe some days more. Mm-hmm. But these were, there was days, from what I recall, there was 2-3 classes a day.
Mm.
So it was, he called it an ashram. It wasn't an ashram in this, it was in the loosest definition of the term. It was an ashram, but it was, but it was dedicated to his practices alone. And those went on all the time.
Now, you mentioned in what you wrote that at that time on the walls of the studio, he cited his gurus, or where what you were learning was coming from.
It was actually not his gurus. It was his guru, which was Maharaj Virsa Singh.
That's who he cited as his guru.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, I just, I've since been in touch with Premka, who was his secretary back then, and a central figure in the early days of 3HO. I have a hard time calling it Kundalini Yoga. So, and
fair enough.
I explained in detail in my story why that is. But so I just call it 3HO, which was his organization. And so I've been in touch with her, and I got in touch with her. She wrote a book, and so she became a little prominent in certain areas of the spiritual scene, especially among people that followed his yoga. But I wanted to verify my memory on some of the things. So I got in touch with her and was able to do that. And I confirmed this with her. Yeah, he had only one guru. That was Virsa Singh. And he spoke about him a lot. And then he had a change. And that was significant for me. A change of one day he started doing teacher trainings at his home, which he called morning sadhana sessions. And he had a number of us there at his home doing practice with him early morning, maybe 8-10 people from what I remember. And then it would always end with us sitting around him. He's sitting up on the couch and us sitting on the floor around him having breakfast, which were just rice cakes with garlic and sprouts. But it was kind of a casual satsang time. And often, if his wife was sending letters, he would read them to us, because most of her letters were about Maharaji, because she would go and do seva, do service at Maharaji, meaning Virsa Singh, at his ashram. And so this one morning, Yogi Bhajan read us a letter, and instead of praising her for her devotion and her service, he started admonishing her and calling her a foolish woman. And listen, what is she's saying? She's treating him like a god. I mean, this was like, in my mind, I remember distinctly, all of a sudden, it was a shock to me. And I remember looking around to see how other people were reacting to it. But it wasn't a deep shock, but something inside of me shifted. And I saw that there was something that shifted in him. And I wasn't quite aware what it was, but it was like the first red flag for me.
It's like that moment with the Scientology guy, right?
Well, the Scientology was actually a satori, actually an awakening experience.
Yeah, I mean, but the moment where there's a discordant note.
Right. It was, yeah, but it was more subtle.
I understand.
It was more subtle because I stayed with Yogi Bhajan for some time. It was just, it was more like something in me just said, wait a second, something's not right. And it wasn't like a aha moment or anything. It was weird.
And in the classes that you were taking with him and that you did ultimately teach, I read, because you started teaching as well,
right,
were the classes really just like the kriya breathing and moving things? Was there philosophical instructions? Did you learn about sutras? Because I guess not, because he kind of came up with it on his own, as I've come to understand it over time, in some ways.
Well, Kundalini Yoga has a tradition. It's a tantric tradition, tantric Shaivite, but also Vajrayana in Tibet, the Buddhist Tantra. But Shaiva Tantra is where Kundalini first appeared. And then it was later adapted in various ways. But it's something that you receive through lineage. It's not something you learn in exercises. Although there are asanas, there are pranayama, there are distinct practices. And a lot of them are combinations, as Yogi Bhajan did, combinations of mantras, asanas, pranayama, and those what he called kriyas. But though there are kriyas here's the distinction. Kriyas, according to in tradition, happen spontaneously through the awakened Shakti, the Kundalini. They're not something that you learn and practice out of a book or out of a teacher's mouth. The distinction is the teacher has to be awakened. The teacher has to be in the awakened state, and then transmission takes place. But that's what Kundalini Yoga is, and that's what Shaktipata is. I mean, Shaktipata means Kundalini awakening, but most cases that we come to know about happen through the transmission from a living guru. But there are Shaktipat transmissions that take place without the presence of the physical guru. They're more rare. Mine was like that. And in my case, I went looking for a guru just because that's what I was driven to do. But if you, in the tantric text, and by the way, Harish, Christopher Wallace,
yeah, he's been on the show a few times.
I know he has. I listened to his interview. But he's an excellent teacher. He really understands these scriptures, these tantric scriptures very well. But at any rate, it's really through transmission.
And I guess Yogi Bhajan had a story of receiving that transmission, right?
Yes. But that transmission, that his story was from Virsa Singh. Mm-hmm. And Virsa Singh has an entirely, completely different path. Doesn't include asanas, doesn't include pranayama at all. It's a completely different, I mean, not that those things aren't prevalent there. See, lineages have their own manifestation of Shakti. So the lineage comes down from guru to disciple, and it has a certain form that it takes. That can change as it goes into different cultures. Like one coming in and immersing themselves back in American culture, and which I've tried to do is I've tried to drop as much of the yoga from my outer life as just naturally drop away. So I feel very American.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.